Hey everybody, how you doing? I'm Dan McGee. Welcome to the garage. So today's special guest is Bob Goldsmith, former attorney and up and coming author of the trials and tribulations of something he went through. Kind of a tragic story that actually turns around and there's hope. So make sure you listen to the whole thing. So how you doing, Bob?
Well, Dan, that's a bit of an open-ended question, but I'll try to start at the starting point and then narrow it down to some type of a finish at some point. But that's a heck of a question right there. But I guess we're going to talk about what is relevant to this show and our objectives. And I want to let people know a little bit about my history. I grew up, of course, with Dan in the southwest suburbs of Cook County, Chicago, Illinois. We went to the same high school together, Argo Community High School, which was one town over. Later on, after high school, I lived in Justice Summit. Eventually, bought my first home in 1990. I moved out to Will County because homes were a lot cheaper out there. So that's how things started out. I was just an average student in high school, probably pretty close to failing, but I got through it. I just barely got through it. Uh, I was good at some things and not so good at a lot of other things. I always had an inkling though to excel in government and history. Those are the two classes that stayed with me throughout my life because those led into my future career. And I'll lead my way up to that at some point. But coming out of high school, probably like a lot of people coming out of high school, I was lost. Didn't know what to do, where to go. Worked a couple odd jobs here and there. Started taking classes at the local community college, a place called Moraine Valley, which is a nice little 2-year institution. Well, I took some classes there for about a year and a half, and I found out one thing about myself was that I could actually be a good student. Even though in high school I was a C and probably a D student, but in junior college I was getting A's and B's, and I was shocked to make it to the president's list. I believe it was my first semester, if not my first year. Unfortunately, for economic reasons, I really couldn't afford to go to school. I had to be one of probably millions of dropouts. I dropped out of college after about a year and a half. Worked a few more odd jobs, and I started getting some good jobs in the early 80s. I worked for big corporations like Pony Express, no longer in existence. Airborne Express, no longer in existence. I worked at FedEx for about 7.5 years. And eventually, knowing that I went to school and I had these credits in my back pocket, and I knew I had this grade point average and this president's list that I was named to, there was always something in the back of my mind telling me, I think you could do better than just a blue collar job. Not that there's anything wrong with it. I really enjoyed my jobs working for those big corporations, but something, a little voice always gnawed at me. So what I started doing at some point many years later, now we're really talking in the 90s, I started taking classes again. I started taking night school, summer school, weekends, mornings, evenings, whatever I could fit into my schedule to start building my credits. Well, the next thing you know, I got my 2-year degree from Moraine Valley Community College. And I'm like, well, why stop here? I transferred my credits to a private university out near Joliet, Illinois, called Lewis University. I got my 4-year degree in my bachelor's degree in business administration at Lewis. I did well. I did very well. Once again, I think I graduated with a high grade point average. And at this point, I really had confidence in myself, something I never had as a young man. So the confidence was really growing. And I told myself after I finally, by the mid 90s, graduated from Lewis University, had my degree, I think I was at that point, I had to be probably about 33, 34 years old before I got my bachelor's degree. So never say die, kids. Always chase your dream. And once I got my degree for Lewis, I thought to myself, well, why stop here? I started thinking about those classes that I liked the most, going back to Argo High School, like history and government. And what do those lead into? What's a segue from history and government? Law. I knew that I had a passion for law. How did I develop this passion? Well, I just did. Sometimes I would get a traffic ticket out here, one of the suburbs. I remember taking a traffic ticket to trial and beating it and having everybody in the courtroom looking at me like I was on a pedestal and giving me a high five. That was the greatest feeling in the world, beating a speeding ticket back in the 90s, with what little knowledge I had in law at the time. But that was my inspiration from that point forward. And then I started challenging things with government agencies. I started challenging things in small claims court, which, by the way, is designed for the common man. Take your grievances to small claims court if you have a problem. Don't let it intimidate you. It's made for the individual or the non-legal person. Always keep that in mind. So I started doing that with some success, quite a bit of success, actually. So I actually started setting my sights on law school. I never thought I could do this in a million years, but at some point, that was the next step in my growth as a person and as a man. I think I started law school when I was 35, because I think I graduated from Lewis University around 33, 34. I didn't graduate law school, I don't think, till about 3.5 years later. I was close to 40 by the time I got my law degree. I was about 40 years old. Then I started working for a criminal attorney in Chicago. That had to be early to mid 2000s. I worked there a couple years, and I found out one thing: I didn't like criminal law. So after a couple years getting experience, I branched off. I started my own practice. It was Robert W. Goldsmith, attorney at law. I eventually got a little office out in Frankfort, out in Will County, which is where I lived and wanted to practice, the Will County courts. Things were really good for a while when I started doing that. I mean, you name it, I was at the top of life by my mid-40s. I had the beautiful family, home in the suburbs, corner lot, swimming pool, movie stars. No, not quite like that. But I had a good, let's say, a good blue collar life at the very least, and maybe a little bit of a white collar life at the same token.
Wow, that actually does sound like a great life, and I got to hand it to you because you were able to work your way through law school, even though it took you a while to do it. How many people can really say that they change their life at that later in life? So, all right, continue on.
Dan, yeah, I worked my tail off. There's no doubt about that. But then, the payoff started coming in, and it was just it was a storybook life at that point. Finally, after my whole life, it seemed like I was always waiting for something, waiting to meet the first girlfriend, waiting to buy the first car, waiting to get out of school, waiting to graduate college, waiting to graduate law school, waiting. Well, the waiting stopped. I was there. I made it. Things went good for a long time. Unfortunately, my entire life got turned topsy-turvy. And at that point in time, my life changed forever, unfortunately. Got into a bitter altercation, domestic altercation with my now ex-wife during the divorce proceedings. And I ended up getting arrested. And that was in late 2010. While serving time in the Will County Jail, pending these allegations, I was fighting the case, defending it vigorously, of course. And sometime later, I was framed by a jailhouse snitch for solicitation of murder for hire. Now, solicitation of murder for hire is a far cry different than a domestic altercation. The penalty for this type of a charge ranged from 20 to 40 years. So it's very similar to a murder, even though nobody ever got hurt or nobody ever gets hurt. It was strictly based on the word of this unreliable jailhouse snitch who claimed that I asked him to kill my wife at that time. So, and the case was all based on him wearing a wire. The detectives And him and the prosecution framed me because while he wore the wire, he did a role play with himself by whispering back and forth, pretending to be me whispering, making implicating statements to him asking questions. I'll try to give you just a brief example of that, as difficult as that may be. But it was something along these lines. He would ask an implicating question. He would say, "Hey, Bob," this is while he's wearing a recording device. He would say, "Bob, you want me to kill her?" And then he'd whisper to himself, "Kill the bitch, kill the bitch, kill the bitch." This happened over a period of, let's say, 10 minutes, several times. Then he went around and told the police and the detectives that I was the one that said, "Kill the bitch, kill the bitch." I was no part of this recording at all. Matter of fact, I later found videotape footage that showed me not even close to him when this recording was made. Nonetheless, I fought that case for up until 2016. I was convicted. I was found guilty. How? I don't know how I was found guilty. I had a dozen witnesses that testified in my favor, and all they had testify was a career criminal who got a deal on his case, and he made up this phony recording so he would walk out the door, which he did, and get rewarded monetarily. And that was what their whole case was substantially based on, the recording and his testimony. And I guess the judge found it that he was more believable than my dozen witnesses. How that became about, I don't know, but it happened. I was sentenced to 30 years. So I was shipped off from Will County Jail to the Illinois Department of Corrections for a few years while I fought my case on appeal. I knew that there was no way that this travesty of justice would stand. I knew it in my heart. I prayed on it. And the Lord put it in my heart that someday I would be vindicated. And I never wavered from that. And I eventually, in 2019, the 3rd District Appellate Court in Ottawa, Illinois, overturned my conviction. And I knew they would. I had appeal issues that were rock solid. So I was sent back for a new trial. Well, here's the problem. When you're sent back for a new trial, you're still in jail while you're awaiting your new trial, which the way they do things in Will County and with many court systems across the country, it takes years to actually go to trial to try to vindicate yourself. So I knew I was going to be in a long, long wait, and there's no way I could fight this case from the inside, because you can't. You just can't. You just don't have access to witnesses. You don't have access to money for experts and things of that nature that you need money for, and attorneys. And you're usually stuck with a public defender who's not going to defend you. I actually defended myself at trial the first time simply because the public defenders wouldn't defend me. All they wanted to do was talk about a plea bargain. Well, I'm not pleading guilty to this or anything related to this because I didn't do it. And I made that clear because they said, well, you could get a good deal on this case. A good deal, meaning a lot less time if you plead to a lesser charge. They actually offered me, I think, 8 years if I would have pled to a conspiracy to commit murder for hire. That wasn't happening. So finally, when I came back, fortunately, I had the wherewithal before I left Will County Jail to file a series of federal lawsuits in the federal courts in Chicago for violations of my constitutional rights. While I was serving my time and waiting for my appeal in the Illinois Department of Corrections, and I was housed down in a little town in southern Illinois called Sumner, Illinois. And while I was down there waiting for the appeal, we had settled my lawsuits against Will County Jail for constitutional rights violations. Wasn't a lot of money, but it was just enough so that when I was sent back on my appeal back to Will County, I had enough money to bail out, which is real important, and enough money to hire an attorney, a top-notch attorney. Well, those two things made all the difference in the world. But yet I still had to fight another 3+ years. But guess what? Hallelujah. And God is good. Last week, strike that, 2 weeks ago, the case was dismissed. And I'm just so thankful that I've finally been vindicated. And I want to thank Dan here for having me here today, that I can tell my story to the world. And what I want to warn people is that this can happen to anybody. Don't think it just happens to certain people or because people do wrong, or some people do wrong or right. It's nothing to do with wrong or right. It's just the way the system is set up. The system is set up not to free you. The system is designed to convict. Matter of fact, you could look at probably any state, any court system, and I'll bet you the conviction rate is somewhere around 95% or higher. And there's a lot of talk right now you're seeing in the news about jail reform, prison reform, and I think those are all good things to start with. But what's much more important than that, no one's talking about it, we need court reform. We need a system that is fairer to the person or the individuals who are fighting their case, trying to prove their innocence, and who want to go to trial and get a fair trial. Because a fair trial, for the most part, unless you have a lot of money, is a fallacy. And I warn you, if you ever get stuck in this system, beware.
So that's an amazing, amazing story.
Been quite a journey, Dan. Quite a journey.
Oh, absolutely.
It all started here in this area, like I was telling you back in 1970s.
Right.
And now I'm back.
Yeah. And I think I know you were mentioning that you're in the process of writing a book.
Well,
and make sure, after you get that written, you come back and we'll talk about it.
Oh, you better believe it, Dan. Absolutely. I've been talking to myself for the last, how long has this been going on now? I almost want to forget. I try to forget, I guess. But this has been going on for about 10 and a half years, actually. And I've been telling myself, I got to write a book. And I kept giving because the hardest thing is starting. And I've been giving myself all these excuses why I haven't started the book. So the most recent excuse for the last several years has been, well, the last chapter is not written yet. And unless I can beat this case, there's really no book. Because there has to be that last chapter where I remain victorious. And that time has finally arrived. So it's time right now to start the book, Dan.
Now, do you have a title for it yet?
Well, I'm flirting around with a couple different things. The framed lawyer, the framed attorney. Or maybe if you want to make it one of these urban novels, two men living in a bathroom.
All right. We'll end it there. Thanks again for coming out, and I hope everybody not necessarily enjoyed the story, but found it to be as interesting as I found it. So talk to you later. This is Dan.
Thanks again, Dan.